Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello and welcome to Then and Now. I'm David Myers, host of this episode and director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We live in a time of massive technological transformation as we've leapt over the last 70 years or so from the advent of the computer to the invention of the internet to the specter of artificial intelligence. The changes wrought by these developments touch every part of our lives, how we communicate with one another, how we constitute society, how we define ourselves as individuals. As part of that transformation, the definition of knowledge, the form of the book, intellectual property, and authorship has changed. And with the prospect of unfettered open access to knowledge, the world will change again. Would that world be a utopia? A dystopia? To help us answer these questions, I'm pleased to welcome Peter Baldwin to Then and Now. Peter is Professor Emeritus of European History at UCLA and the author of 8 wide-ranging books that reveal his proclivity for taking on wide swaths of time and space in his research. Peter has had a recurring interest in knowledge, the way it is produced, transmitted, and regulated. An earlier book of his was devoted to the history of copyright law called The Copyright Wars. And he has just recently published a new book from MIT Press called Athena Unbound, Why and How Scholarly Knowledge Should Be Free for All. Welcome to Then and Now, Peter.
Thank you, David, for having me.
So let's jump right in. Tell us why you called your book Athena Unbound.
Well, it's a riff on Shelley, Prometheus Unbound. Prometheus, of course, was the god of knowledge and was punished for bringing fire to humans. And this is now unbinding Athena, the god of wisdom, or the goddess of wisdom.
And what did you mean to convey?
Well, that open access allows us, of course, to make knowledge something that is freely available to anyone who, in this particular case, has the ability to access the web, which is, more or less pretty close to 2/3 of humanity as we speak and growing every day.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, this book seems in the trajectory of your career a natural outcome because, as I mentioned in the introduction, you wrote an earlier book called The Copyright Wars, which seems closely connected. And I'm interested in knowing what occupied your interest with the subject of copyright. What brought you to study copyright?
Copyright was really brought on by my interest in property. And property is a fascinating aspect of human society. Many political theories think it's the most important aspect of forming community, defending it. And among the various forms of property, of course, tangible property has a kind of Lockean component to it. We really sort of believe that, there's a there, and there is a kind of justifiable sense in which one owns something. But with intangible property, with intellectual property, property in ideas, it is simply something that is completely created by the state. It's not something you can, in any physical sense, own or contain or control. The state gives you rights to it. And so it's, in a sense, the perfect way of studying property because everything about it is determined by the rules we as humans, elected together in communities and governed by states, use to determine it. So it's sort of a Rorschach test of what we think about when we sort of enter into community. How long do we give people rights to intellectual property? How do we define intellectual property? Under what conditions do we let them do it? It's a fascinating way of studying differences between cultures in these terms, and also development over time within any given culture. And it's all something that we control and we determine, and therefore completely human-made.
So tell us briefly about when copyright comes into play.
Well, copyright has been around for a long time. 1710, the Statute of Anne, is the first normally recognized copyright law in the UK, and other nations, the US, France, sort of follow in the 18th century after that. The significance of copyright in the 18th century was that the field before that had been completely sort of open. Anyone could do anything they wanted with any content. You could take somebody else's work, you could reprint it, you could sell it, you could even claim it was your own without, giving the name of the author. It was sort of Wild West. And what the first copyright laws did was to regulate. It turned intellectual property, it turned ideas and their expression into something that belonged to the creator, at least for a short period of time. So in a sense, it privatized ideas. And the point was to do so in order to give creators a spur to further creativity. It gave them a stake in being able to sell to booksellers and to their audience the fruits of their labors, and therefore be prompted to do more with it. But of course, at the same time that it created a kind of sense of private property in these ideas, it also created the public domain, because after a certain while, in the beginning of 14 years, the ideas and their expression fell into the public domain and became anyone's to do with whatever they wanted.
Yeah, so crucial here is the role of the state and the new regulation of property that comes with that modern notion or evolving modern notion of the state, as well as the creation of discrete realms, public and private. And I think here of Jürgen Habermas's famous analysis of the creation of the public sphere in the 18th century, in precisely this time period that you're speaking of. Part of what is at play in a kind of triangulated relationship when we think about copyright is the state as the regulator, the interests of the author, and I suppose the mythic readers that occupy that public sphere. I wonder if you can sort of help us understand the relations amongst those three actors, and particularly between authors and readers.
Well, that is, of course, the primal tension. On the one hand, you have those with a stake in controlling the content, which is to say authors, but also insofar as authors give up their rights, the rights holders, which is usually publishers, at least it was in the beginning. So you have the rights holders, whether authors or publishers on one hand, and then you have readers, the audience out there. And they obviously have diametrically opposed interests in this. On the one hand, you want to control and profit from the content. On the other hand, you want to get high quality content at as cheap a price as you can if you are the public. But of course, at the heart here, authors are also readers. And in a sense, every author has a sort of an ambiguous stake in this, because an author is an author, of course, wants to profit, but an author is a reader, wants to be able to enjoy as much in the same way that any person who is just a reader does of the content that's out there. And we see this in particular if you look at derivative art forms. There are, after all, an awful lot of art forms that rely on other art, on what one might call primary art forms. So in the beginning of the 18th century, this was something that was fought out in terms of etchings and lithographs, which were taken of paintings and then became, in a sense, their own art forms. But in our own day, film is to a large extent a derivative art form, at least one that is based on other art forms, usually in the form of novels or screenplays or plays, or using other forms of art. And so in that sense, even artists and authors have an interest, of course, in access in the same way that readers do. In Germany in the 19th century, there was a big dispute between poets and musicians, because the musicians wanted to be able to use poets to write lieder, to set poems to music without having to pay authors royalties or ask them for rights. And there was a big battle, and in effect, the poets lost and the musicians won. And in Germany then, I don't quite know what the situation is today, but composers can set poems freely to music. And so, we all know about Schubert's Winterreise, but most of us have no idea who the poor poet who wrote the Winterreise was, who got ripped off, and while Schubert sort of won out. But I mean, that is the sense in which the authors, even when today they scream bloody murder because of the potentiality of their rights as creators being violated, they too, of course, themselves violate the rights of other creators by being inspired, by making use of other people's works. No one, except in the most fevered of imaginations of people who think that the romantic idea of the creator is true. Nobody works in a vacuum. Everybody is dependent on other people. Everyone is inspired by other people. My favorite example of this is Sherry Levine, who takes photographs of Walker Evans' photographs. Walker Evans was a photographer who took photographs of people in the Depression and Dust Bowl and so forth. And Sherry Levine simply takes a photograph of Walker Evans' photograph and portrays it as her own work. It says it's after Walker Evans. And of course, she's making a point precisely about authorship and the extent to which it's indebted to others. But it's extraordinary that someone like Sherry Levine would expect any kind of authorial rights herself in what is so clearly, at least at first glance, a ripoff of somebody else. So in that sense, this core tension, I think, is undermined by the way in which every author is also a consumer of other authors, and in that sense, has sort of ambiguous interests in this.
So this point about the derivative nature of some art foreshadows your interest in and promotion of, it seems to me, the idea of open access, if I'm reading you correctly. And we'll want to understand a little bit more the connection between them. But before we get to that, can you say a little bit about what role the university plays in this process of a new world of consumption habits and notions of intellectual property? Because the university has been so linked to the production of knowledge, intellectual property clearly is part of the story. What role do you see the university playing in this important era of transition?
Well, the university is, of course, one of the major sources of new knowledge. It's not quite as big a source of new knowledge, or not quite as exclusive a source of knowledge as universities themselves sometimes think. 2/3 of all research done in the world is paid for by corporations, Boeing building its airplanes, or Google its search engines, or whatever it is. And that, of course, is not subject to open access. No one would sort of realistically argue that corporations should give away their trade knowledge, their domain expertise, and that sort of thing. But of the third that is produced by universities, of course, the bulk of that is financed either directly or indirectly by governments, and therefore ultimately by taxpayers. And if we break it down between the various disciplines, the bulk of science research is done, I think, in the corporate world, a large chunk of it. In the university world, no doubt, the biggest part of that has to do with sort of basic science as opposed to applied science. But if we then shift instead to the humanities and social sciences, obviously, the vast majority of that is done by and in universities. There aren't many corporations out there that are, backing the study of the dietary habits of French peasants in the 19th century, or whatever it is that the topic at hand may be. That tends to be the university's domain. So when we talk about open access, what we're talking about effectively is the kind of government taxpayer-financed work that is done by universities. That is fundamentally what we're discussing, and we're talking about who it is that is to pay for making that freely available. So it's not all knowledge, it's only a chunk of it, but it's a big and important chunk.
But part of what you want to argue, I think if I understood your last response correctly, is that already so much research is work for hire, as a term you use throughout the book, which you think is important to pushing us to a wider embrace of open access. Can you talk about this idea of work for hire, building on what you just said?
Well, so work for hire is a copyright doctrine that was introduced sort of sometime in the mid-19th century, and it dealt with works that were produced, as the term implies, that were produced at a sponsor's behest who paid for it. And in the beginning, it was mainly sort of portraits. And the question was, if I paid you, artiste, to paint a portrait of my dog, who owned the work, who had the sort of rights to the work? And it was generally agreed that the person who sponsored the work had the rights to it because the artist was doing it not as somehow ineffable product of their creativity. They were doing it for hire, and therefore that's part of the deal. They sort of gave up the rights to the work, and the owner of the dog and of the portrait of the dog could do with it what he or she wanted. Now, extend this to a larger scale, and a great deal of work that is done, all the work that is done in the corporate world, for example, is work for hire. None of the engineers who work for Boeing or Google or anything like that have any conception that they might be able to make a claim for their work. Most of the people who work in Hollywood work for hire. They get attribution, of course, as we see. You can spend 15 minutes scrolling through the names of the people attached to a Hollywood movie. So attribution is certainly a big part of it, and whether you're above this and below that, whatever it is that people in Hollywood squabble about when they are working, that's another matter. But attribution is not the issue. But the stuff is fundamentally owned by the studios, who can do with it what they want, including editing and cutting and all the things that the artists then get upset about when something is left on the floor.
And sometimes go on strike, we should add.
And sometimes go on strike, exactly. So the question is, should not work for hire also apply to the academic world? In a technical sense, it does not. American academics are exempt by common law from the work for hire doctrine. But it seems to me that, in fact, what they largely do is work for hire. And I don't really see why it should not also apply to them, thereby giving those taxpayers, which is to say all of us as taxpayers, who have a stake in being able to read the work that we have paid for through university research funding, the salaries that professors have paid, and all that sort of thing, giving us the ability as readers to access what otherwise is locked up behind paywalls and accessible only to those people who happen to have the ability to get into a university library or other major research institution.
So the logic is university professors receive a salary. They should stop being so vain and greedy in seeking additional revenue through the sale of their books, and recognize that they're essentially paid for their research, and therefore their research should be accessible to all. Yeah?
That is putting it perhaps a little more stridently than I want to be in the company of my colleagues. But yes, basically that's it. And can I just add to that, that effectively this is a dispute. That is to say, there are people who resist this idea that what the professoriate does is work for hire. This is a dispute that is mainly engaged in among people who are our colleagues. When I say our, I mean people in the humanities and social sciences, and in particular, not to point a finger, but historians are among the worst offenders, because historians are in a field where books with some scholarly pretensions are still one of the last few disciplines that the reading public actually still buys. If you're in analytic philosophy, the chances of you writing a bestseller are vanishingly small, and the same goes, I think, for most literary criticism. But history, there's still potboilers out there to be written. And so I think historians suffer from this idea that they don't want to be locked into work for hire, because who knows, that book on Napoleon's, footwear or whatever it is that they're working on may actually take off and become a bestseller. But let me just sort of say on top of this, that the scientists are in that sense not the problem. The scientists have no illusion that their work is ever going to sort of be best-selling, it's ever going to have a commercial potential. They are paid salary-wise, and they are rewarded by the sort of internal honorifics and prizes and recognition within the academy that that everybody hopes for and aspires to, but they have no pretensions whatsoever to have sort of sales value. I mean, obviously, every so often somebody goes off and writes a scientific bestseller, but on the whole, scientific popular literature is written by science journalists, not by scientists, in contrast to historians who will, often at some point in their lives attempt the popular work that they hope might sell. And a lot of that distinction between the scientists and the humanities and the social sciences has to do with the medium in which they work. So scientists write articles. Those articles have never been paid for. Since the scientific journals started in the 17th century, they have never paid for content. There's no illusion among scientists that they will ever get paid for this sort of stuff. Nor do the scientists really care about the aesthetics of their work. They don't care about whether it's a nice print face. They don't care about whether the footnotes are at the bottom of the page. All they care about is whether the content gets out there. And in that sense, we in the humanities and social sciences could take a leaf from their book. Bad metaphor here, but in this case, could take a leaf from what they're doing and focus more on the content and less on the presentational issues that often are what we focus on. And then finally, the distinction between us, the humanities, social sciences, and the scientists is that they work much more collaboratively than we do. In the 1890s, I think it's something like 5% of all the journal articles in the New England Journal of Medicine were by more than one person. had more than a single author. And now the statistic is completely flipped. It's almost no articles in the New England Journal that are not produced collaboratively. And obviously, your authorial stake in a piece of work is going to be less emotionally gripping if you are one of, a dozen. Some scientific articles have had as many as 3,000 and 5,000 co-authors. If you're one of 5,000 co-authors, you're probably not really going to sweat the details of whether or not there are any royalties to split or anything like that, compared to if you're a single author book author and hoping that you're going to be end up on being interviewed by Charlie Rose or whatever the modern equivalent is.
So is this distinction that you're drawing a function as well of how applied an enterprise is? And that is to say, the sciences are much more conditioned to the application of the knowledge they generate to all sorts of functions in society. Humanists and soft social scientists, less so. I'm just curious, are you also making a case for the application of social, scientific, and humanistic knowledge beyond the present, or just a case for greater receptivity to open access?
Well, the two issues here. There are lots of people working in science with no expectation that their work will be applied to anything practical in their lifetime. So I don't think that's the big distinction. And conversely, there are a lot of people working in the social sciences, whose work is applicable in the real world. So I'm not totally sure that that's the distinction here. But the sciences, look, the fundamental thing is the sciences have solved the open access problem for themselves because they don't have to pay for it. They have effectively raided the acquisitions budgets of the major research libraries and harnessed that money to their journals, allowing them to flip to open access. For every scientific article published in the United States, of which there are about 1.5, 2 million a year, something like that, there are, when you just divide the number by the total science money, almost $300,000 of scientific funding for every article written. And keep in mind that there are many scientists who write hundreds of articles a year. So we're talking about massive amounts of money tied up into each scientific article. When you've paid $300,000 to produce the research behind a scientific article, to pay another $3,000 to have it published open access is sort of a rounding error. It's just not a big deal. It's not worth fighting about. So in a sense, the sciences don't have to worry about the money it takes to publish their work open access because it's already in their budgets, or it would take a very small addition to their budgets to make it open access. That's very different, of course, in the humanities and the social sciences, partly because we write books rather than articles, which come along less frequently, but cost that much more to make open access, and primarily because we don't have the money to just write it into our research budgets that it is going to be published open access. So there's a huge hurdle for us to surmount when we look at open access. The scientists don't really have that hurdle. It's already been paid for. They don't worry about what it looks like. They just want the stuff, the content out there so their peers can read it. And they don't expect any rewards beyond the recognition that they get in scientific and intellectual terms.
So one of the most appealing features of open access is the prospect of the democratization of access to knowledge, of knowledge itself. All will have access without regard to social class or rank. But as we've come to learn from our observation of the way in which the internet works, the free flow of knowledge can also mean the transmission of misinformation, hate, and bigotry in ways that can be quite destructive to society. And so how does one go about open access in a world that seems quite different from the early years of copyright, which was, as you said, regulated by the state? The internet has relatively little regulation, and open access presumably would have none. So what can prevent transforming this tool of democratization of knowledge into a tool of the transmission of toxic hate?
Well, okay, there are a number of things that need some unpacking in your question. First of all, the democratization of information has been going on since the printing press was invented. Robert Darnton made a career out of studying the pamphleteers before the French Revolution, who spewed out, enormous quantities of bills. Mass circulation papers, the penny post, all these sorts of things have been disseminating knowledge since the word go. So obviously the internet is a sort of quantum leap. There's no question about that. Now, whether the internet has a problem in terms of the stuff that's on it is one question. Whether open access is in any sense responsible or should be sort of drawn over the same comb as that is an entirely different question. So let's start with the question of, should the internet be regulated? There's no question that there's enormous amounts of garbage and much of it is toxic and disgusting. So I don't really want to wade into the issue of whether or not that should be regulated. I will say one thing, and that is that the safe harbors clause in copyright, which is what allows the internet providers not to have to police the content on their sites, is what is attacked by some people who want to regulate the internet, has been preserved so far in reform attempts in Congress, and is on the whole, I think, a very good thing, because it effectively shifts the onus to those who want to take stuff down to the rights owners, which is to say that there's a lot of wiggle room to put stuff up on the net and not have it immediately violate copyright law, not immediately be sued, not immediately have the rights owners clamoring to take it down. The rights owners are the ones who have to go through the process of getting it down. So it allows the system to be sort of inefficient, but also freer than it otherwise would be if the content providers, not the rights owners, but the ones who post it, were held liable. Then, of course, the whole system would change and we'd have a much less free-flowing internet we do. We would also have a better police internet. But anyway, that takes me to the broader question of where does open access come into this? Because it seems to me clear that the internet and whatever problems it has is a problem that goes beyond open access. And open access can hardly be sort of treated in the same ways as bad information out there on the internet. Indeed, I would be willing to say that open access in effect solves the regulatory process for its own content, for the stuff that comes through it, because that content has already been policed, it has been regulated, it has been vetted, it has been examined by colleagues and by peers. And so that is, in effect, the good part of the web. And insofar as we can improve the web by raising the quality, open access will help do that, because what comes out of open access is good information. It is not the bilge that those who want to regulate the web worry most about.
But what prevents anybody from posting or uploading to an open access platform anything they want, including a manual on how to build a nuclear bomb or engage in a mass attack on a given target?
Anyone can upload to whatever site will take them already. That's already the case. It's got nothing to do with open access. Open access sites aren't ones that post any old stuff. Open access sites are as policed as any other academic site, at least if they want to be respected and taken it seriously, they are. They have as much peer review as a normal journal. It's not that they put up anything, it's that it doesn't cost you anything to read it. That's the absolute only distinction.
So the open access site, just so we can be clear, would be, for example, a university press website, which has as part of its content scholarly monographs that instead of appearing in print, appear in digital form, open access to all. Yes?
Yes, precisely. And they might appear in print as well. But the point is, whatever is on an open access, on a scholarly open access site, will have undergone exactly the same process of peer review as something that is locked down on paper and sold at a price in a bookstore. There's no distinction in terms of the scholarly qualities and the scholarly gatekeeping, if you will. Now, there is a dispute, but this has to do with the broader issue of digitality and less to do with open access as such. There's a dispute as to whether we can review pre-publication peer review or post-publication peer review, and is post-publication peer review, even is it really doable? The whole point of pre-publication review, peer review, in the conventional sense, was not only to assure a certain level of quality, it was also to make sure that you didn't waste analog resources because a journal that had 100 pages to fill didn't want to spend 20 of them on a bad article when it could be publishing a good article. So it had to do that before it published. But nowadays, when you just put something up on the web, size is no issue. Anything can be put up. So there's no cost to putting it up and reviewing it after the fact and then pulling it down again, the way sometimes happens with scientific papers. So, but that's sort of a separate dispute. The point is, there's no question that review is necessary. I'm very much against those people, and they exist, who think that open access means you don't review the stuff. I don't see we can avoid reviewing. I mean, I think it's a good thing to review. And I think the university world ought to do more in rewarding that kind of review, because it is otherwise hard to persuade colleagues to do it. But review is certainly necessary because there's so much stuff we can't read at all, and we need some pointers as to where to begin and what the good stuff is and what isn't.
But you're not insisting on pre-publication review, if I understand correctly, which would seem to be part and parcel of our very notion of, you know, what makes for a vetted piece of work.
Well, it doesn't really, because you could say that there's no reason why it can't be vetted after it's been put up. I mean, effectively, when you send out an article for review, you are vetting it, right? Whether that vetting takes place before it's posted or after it's posted is almost irrelevant. I mean, you know, we can argue about this, and people do, of course. But you know, the act of publication in that analog sense isn't as determinative or important as it used to be, because publication is a more fluid process now. You post, you see how it turns out. If it's a bad article, people object to it, you pull it. You put up a revised version. You know, it isn't this all or nothing, there it is in print forever and ever, and it's never going to be changed. Therefore, we really got to make sure it's good before we do that. That has faded, but that's got nothing so much to do with open access as it does with digitality as a whole.
So what, Peter, would open access do to our notion of authorship and intellectual property?
Our notion of intellectual property, it weakens it in the sense that it weakens our ability to monetize intellectual property and get paid for it, because it's effectively giving it away, or it's having somebody else pay for it. It's having the person who's producing the content pay for it rather than the consumer of the content pay for it. But it doesn't, in any sense, I think, detract from our ability to get credit. The attribution right, which is arguably the core of copyright, our desire as authors is to have our ideas recognized as our ideas much more than to be paid for them. It doesn't detract from that. If anything, I think it's enhanced. But that has probably more to do with digitality than open access. Again, because with digitality you can do searches in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible, and things like priority on an idea can be determined more precisely than used to be the case, simply by virtue of being able to search. So our notion of intellectual property, I think, it changes. You asked about our idea of authorship.
Yeah, if we don't compensate people for their work, if we have post-publication reviews, it may be that we're entering onto a slippery slope in terms of notion of our notion of authorship, no?
Well, if by authorship you mean that sort of romantic idea that the author sits alone in his or her garret and has inspiration from his or her muse and completely, in isolation from the rest of society, produces the masterpiece, which he or she then owns intellectually and economically entirely as the product of their soul. In that sense, yes, of course, it chips away at that. But we've been chipping away at that for reasons that have nothing to do with open access for at least the last half century, and probably more. I mean, what is postmodernism? What is the eternal debate we had 50 years ago about the death of the author, if not precisely a sort of leavening and an effacing of this idea of romantic authorship? So we now all understand that we're all magpies. We all sort of are inspired by others. We all, without even knowing it, channel things that we have heard somewhere else. And people have been caught up in what they will hotly deny are plagiarism issues, because an idea stuck in their head and they don't quite remember where it came from, and there it is. This guy, this musician, Ed Sheeran, who's constantly getting sued for plagiarism in pop music. He doesn't read music. He's just sort of a savant who he hears something once, he likes it. 3 weeks later, he's storming away, and voila, some version of it appears and he doesn't even know where it comes from. And then he gets, hit up by some lawyer for Marvin Gaye or whoever, who says, no, it's already been done. And the poor fellow probably doesn't even know that he's done it. I'm not saying we're all like that, but I think we've already moved so far away from that romantic notion of authorship. Open access is just another, in this case, I think rather minor step along that road that we've progressed far along.
Yeah, you say in the book, open access is but the latest instance of an evolutionary imperative. So what, to your mind, is new and revolutionary about open access?
Well, there have been a number of technological steps in sort of this direction. Gutenberg was better than parchment, and wood paper was better than parchment, and paperbacks were cheaper than hardbacks, and the Xerox machine was a huge revolution in this respect. But compared to digitization, that's all just sort of little baby steps. And digitization, and again, this is digitization, not open access. The two things are often sort of assumed to be one and the same, but they're not. Digitization now makes it possible that the last copy of a work is effectively for free, and that the dissemination of works are effectively for free. That doesn't mean that the first copy is for free. The first copy still has to be paid for. Everything that it takes to present the manuscript, if we're talking about a book or an article, typeface, copy editing, copywriting, deciding how big the margin should be, and all that kind of stuff, that has to be paid for. But the last copy, which in the old days, in the analog days, cost just as much as the first copy in physical terms. It had to be printed and bound and shipped and stored and all the other rest of it. That last copy is now completely costless. So it's the last copy at the margin where the revolution lies. And the first copy still has to be paid for. And the whole debate about open access is effectively about who's going to pay for the first copy. Once we have the first copy, the game is on and anyone can have it.
So as a final question, Peter, can you give us a sense of where you think things are headed? And I'm particularly thinking of two forces in our present world that can serve to accelerate or restrain the path toward open access. One is artificial intelligence, and the other is the attempts that we see in our time to restrict access to books, which, of course, can translate from the printed version to open access very easily. So where do you think we're headed, and what are the bumps in the road that we're going to have to contend with?
AI is a little beyond my pay grade, but that doesn't prevent me from having an opinion on it. And it is this. As I understand it, at least in American copyright, you cannot copyright content produced by a non-human. If that's true, and if that continues to be the case, that means that we will shortly be living in a universe where the vast bulk of all content cannot be copyrighted. This raises the question what the point of the copyright system is at all. Now, if that is true, it effectively only brings forward the date that we were going to, brings forward the point at which we were going to be facing the same problem. Because right now, if you look at a major research library, something like 20% of its content is in the public domain, only 20%, and 80% is still locked up. But now think 1,000 years into the future. Those will have reversed, and a tiny smidgen of work will be copyrighted, and a huge bulk of content will be public domain. That is going to have an influence on how we see creativity. We are going to be so steeped in a vast available mass of content that our ideas of creativity will entirely change, and we will not, I think, fetishize it to the extent that we do today, and certainly to the extent that the Romantic authors did. And ChatGPT and its ilk is bringing forward that day where the content we're dealing with is freely available because it cannot be copyrighted, and where we will have to deal with different ideas of creativity. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. It is something that's going to take a lot of getting used to, but a world of available, unlimited, high-quality content is not a worse world than the one we live in at the moment. The thing about ChatGPT is, as I understand it, it does not go behind the paywalls. So if you want ChatGPT and its like to work well, you definitely want open access because you want it chewing on the good parts of the web, not just on the garbage parts of the web. And therefore, it seems to me that you want to feed it as much quality in as you therefore can expect to get quality out. And the other issue about access to reading, it seems to me here too, the news is generally speaking good, but much more immediately so. Unless you are willing, and not even Florida, I think, is willing to do that, clamp down on the internet in the way that the Chinese or the Saudis do, and not allow access to the web at all for certain. There is no way you can impose censorship on open access content. If it's on the web, you have access to it everywhere. So therefore, if you have something controversial to say, and you want the good citizens of Florida to be able to read it, I suggest that you publish it open access, allowing everyone in the world to do so.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Peter Baldwin, for a most stimulating conversation. The name of the book is Athena Unbound, Why and How Scholarly Knowledge Should Be Free for All. Thanks so much for joining us on Then and Now, Peter.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.